there is a name that echoes differently than other names, not because of what it conjures in the imagination. The horses, the steps, the banners snapping in a cold Mongolian wind, but because of what it means in the quiet arithmetic of history. When you draw a line beneath the life of Genghis Khan and tally what he accomplished, the numbers refuse to seem real. They belong, it feels, to myth, to legend, to the kind of story human beings tell around fires when they want to feel both thrilled and humbled at once. And yet, every last figure is true. At the height of his power, Genghis Khan ruled over 12 million square miles of territory, a domain so vast that, were it laid over a modern map of the world, it would swallow China whole, consume Russia from its eastern shore nearly to Moscow, devour Persia, Central Asia, and great portions of Eastern Europe without pause. No single ruler before him had ever commanded so much of the earth's surface. No single ruler after him, save his own descendants, ever would again. He was, by almost any measure history has ever devised, the greatest conqueror who ever lived. But to begin with conquest is to begin in the middle of the story. And this story, like all stories worth telling slowly, begins much earlier and much smaller. It begins on the open steppe of northeastern Mongolia, sometime around the year 162, in a felt tent, in a nomadic clan of modest standing. A boy was born clutching a clot of blood in his fist. His mother named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently captured. It was considered an auspicious name. In the years to come, the word auspicious would prove almost comically inadequate. Temujin's childhood was not gentle. It rarely is for the people who go on to reshape the world. His father, Yasuge, was poisoned by enemies when Temujin was only 9 years old. The cruelest kind of abandonment, the one that arrives without warning. The clan his father had led promptly deserted the widow and her children, leaving them to survive the steppe alone. The steppe, in winter, does not forgive. They ate roots. They ate mice. They endured. It is difficult to overstate how unlikely Temujin's future greatness must have seemed in those years. He was a boy without a clan, which on the Mongolian steppe was nearly the same as being a boy without a future. He was captured and enslaved as a young teenager. He was poor in horses, poor in allies, poor in every currency, the steppe recognized as meaningful. The world, at that point, had every reason to forget him. It did not get the chance. What Temujin possessed, what no amount of poverty or misfortune could strip away, was a quality of mind that history only produces rarely and never on schedule. He was a reader of people in an era before literacy was common. He understood loyalty not merely as something to demand, but as something to earn and then fiercely protect. Where the tribal world around him operated on the fracture lines of blood and clan, Temujin began to imagine something newer, something stranger, a meritocracy, a world where the capable man, regardless of his birth, could rise. He began to gather followers, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, the way a river gathers itself before a canyon. He formed alliances, dissolved old feuds, and waged the kind of patient, calculating warfare that his rivals, still thinking in the old tribal vocabulary of raid and revenge, were entirely unprepared for. By 1206, after decades of war and coalition building across the Mongolian plateau, every tribe beneath that enormous sky had either bent the knee or been destroyed. At a great assembly on the banks of the Onon River, the leaders of a unified Mongolian people bestowed upon Temujin a title that had never before been used: Genghis Khan, Universal Ruler, Oceanic Ruler. It is a title that does not quite translate into any single English word, because no English word was ever designed to carry that much weight. He was, at last, Genghis Khan, and he was only just beginning. What follows in his story is not merely a tale of armies and battles. though there are armies and battles enough to fill a library. It is a tale of governance and genius, of a postal system that spanned a continent, of religious tolerance practiced at a scale the medieval world had never seen, of trade routes reopened, of languages transcribed, of an empire so administratively sophisticated that merchants could travel from China to the Mediterranean in relative safety, a feat that would not be replicated for centuries. It is also, in honesty, a tale of devastating destruction, of cities reduced to rubble, of populations lost. The full picture of Genghis Khan has always contained both of these truths, and any documentary that does not carry both is telling only half a story. We will carry both. In the segments ahead, we will follow Temujin from those rootless, freezing years of childhood, through the forging of an empire that beggars all comparison, to the quiet, still debated question of where and how the greatest conqueror in human history finally came to rest. Settle in. We have a world to cross. Part 2-2. The Broken Step. The world that made him. Before we can understand the man, we must understand the land. Close your eyes for a moment, or simply let your gaze soften and try to picture it. An ocean of grass stretching from the forests of Manchuria in the east to the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains in the west. No fences, no roads in any sense the modern imagination would recognize, just wind and sky and an endless undulation of terrain that seems, to the unfamiliar eye, almost featureless, almost empty. It is not empty. The Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was alive with movement, with tens of thousands of horses, with great herds of sheep and cattle drifting slowly across the grasslands, with the round felt tents called gers rising and collapsing and rising again in a different place, week after week, season after season, following the ancient rhythms of pasture and weather. The people of the steppe did not build cities because the steppe did not reward permanence. What it rewarded was adaptability, speed, the ability to pack everything you owned onto a horse and be somewhere entirely different by nightfall. This is the world Temujin entered in 1162, and it is important to sit with it for a moment, to feel its openness, its beauty, and its absolute, unrelenting danger, before we go any further. The steppe was, by the standards of any settled civilization looking in from outside, a world in a state of permanent, low-grade war. This was not because the Mongolian people were uniquely savage. History has too often made that lazy mistake, projecting the violence of the steppe outward, as though it were a character flaw rather than a rational response to circumstance. The truth is considerably more interesting. On the steppe, there were no walls to shelter behind. There were no granaries to draw from in lean years, no stone fortresses to retreat to when a neighboring clan grew ambitious. Wealth was entirely portable. It moved on four legs and could be taken in a single night's raid, and so raiding, in a very real sense, was the economy. To raid your neighbors before they raided you was not merely aggression. It was, by the brutal logic of that world, survival. The result was a landscape of almost constant fracture. Clans allied and betrayed one another in cycles so fast and so familiar that loyalty itself had become a kind of currency, valuable precisely because it was so rare. Blood ties mattered, but blood ties had limits, and when resources grew scarce, even family lines could bend and snap. The Mongolian plateau in the 12th century was divided among dozens of tribes: Merkits, Tartars, Karaids, Naimans, and many others, each of them roughly equal in military capability, each of them too proud and too pragmatic to submit to any of the others for long. This was the world's great unresolved equation. The steppe had never been truly unified. No single man had ever managed to hold together what 100 competing interests perpetually pulled apart. Temujin would solve that equation, but not before it nearly destroyed him. He was born, as we have said, into modest circumstances. The son of Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigan clan, a man of some local reputation but nothing resembling real power. His mother, Hoelun, was herself a woman of remarkable character. She had been abducted from another man on her wedding journey, which was, on the steppe, a grim but not uncommon way for a marriage to begin. She would prove, in the years to come, to be one of the most formative influences on her eldest son's life. Her toughness was not the performed toughness of someone trying to appear strong. It was the deep, structural toughness of a person who had learned that the world does not pause for grief. When Yasuge died, poisoned at a feast by Tatar enemies, in the manner of a man who perhaps trusted too freely, Temujin was 9 years old. The clan's response was swift and cold. They had followed Yasuge because Yasuge was useful to them. A widow with 5 children and no horses to speak of was not useful to anyone. They left. Hoelun argued. She pleaded. She is said to have ridden after the departing clan carrying the banner of the Borjigin, that ancient symbol of tribal identity, as though the sight of it might shame them into staying. It did not. The clan rode on, and the banner meant nothing to people who had already decided what they were going to do. What followed? Those years of isolation on the steppe is the part of Temujin's story that most histories pass through quickly, as though hurrying toward the more dramatic chapters ahead. But there is something worth pausing over here, something important in the texture of those years. The family survived. On almost nothing, they survived. Hoelun fed her children with whatever the steppe offered. Wild fruit, fish pulled from frozen rivers, the small animals a boy can catch if he is patient and hungry enough. Temujin learned in those years what real scarcity feels like. He learned that pride and hunger occupy the same body at the same time, and that the combination either breaks a person or produces something altogether different, something harder than iron and more flexible. Adolescence did not relieve the pressure, it compounded it. Temujin had, in the years before his father's death, been promised in marriage to a girl named Berta, the daughter of a chief from a neighboring tribe. This was common practice. Betrothals were political instruments, ways of binding clans together in the fragile temporary peace that mutual interest could create. Berta's father, Dai Sechen, had seen something in the young Temujin that impressed him, whether it was intelligence, bearing, or simply a quality in the boy's eyes that suggested future consequence. History does not record. But Dai Sechen had kept the promise, and Berta had waited. Before Temujin could fully reclaim what little social standing a marriage might restore to him, however, the steppe delivered another blow. A rival clan, the Merkits, descended upon the family's camp and took Berta. This was, again, the steppe's brutal logic at work. Hoelun herself had once been taken from a Merkit man, and generational grievance had a long memory on the grasslands. They were not taking Berta out of cruelty precisely. They were balancing an account that they believed had never been settled. To another man, to a man without Temujin's particular quality of mind, this might have been the end. A young man without a clan, without resources, without an army, does not typically recover a stolen wife from a tribe of hardened raiders. Temujin did not accept that framing. He went instead to the most powerful ally he could identify, Togrul, the Khan of the Koraids, who had once been a sworn blood brother to Temujin's father. The relationship was tenuous. Years had passed. Togrul owed the dead Yasugai nothing, but Temujin approached him not as a supplicant begging a favor, but as a man conducting a transaction, offering Berta's precious sable fur wedding cloak as a gift, and framing the alliance in terms of mutual benefit and ancestral obligation simultaneously. It was a diplomatic maneuver of considerable sophistication from a man who had received no formal education in diplomacy whatsoever. Togrul agreed. Together with another growing ally, a childhood friend named Jamuka, they rode against the Merkits. Berta was recovered. The raid was a success, But something more important than a rescue had just occurred. Temujin had demonstrated, for the first time on a meaningful scale, his signature ability, the capacity to make allies rather than simply inherit them. In a world where alliances were mostly formed by birth and broken by appetite, this was genuinely unusual. People began to notice. The years that followed were years of accumulation. Not of wealth exactly, though wealth came too, but of trust. Temujin gathered followers in the way that certain rare people do, through a quality that is difficult to name precisely, but impossible to miss in practice. He remembered names. He shared plunder equitably. He promoted men based on what they could do rather than which tent they had been born in. To warriors accustomed to a world where a man's ceiling was fixed by his lineage, this was revelatory. He also developed, in these years, a military philosophy that would eventually overturn everything his enemies thought they understood about warfare. The steppe already produced extraordinary horsemen, men who could ride before they could walk, who could fire arrows with lethal accuracy at full gallop, who needed no baggage train because they carried their sustenance with them. What Temujin added to this formidable foundation was discipline, coordination, and the willingness to learn from every opponent he faced. He studied defeat as carefully as he studied victory. When a strategy failed him, he did not repeat it. When an enemy showed him a technique he had not seen before, he adopted it. His army would eventually absorb the siege engineers of China, the administrative systems of Persia, and the diplomatic protocols of half a dozen civilizations, not because Temujin was instructed to be cosmopolitan, but because his fundamental orientation toward the world was relentlessly, practically curious. This is the quality that separates conquerors of mere ambition from conquerors who genuinely reshape history. Ambition alone builds empires that collapse within a generation. Curiosity, the real, open-handed desire to understand how things work and incorporate what is useful, builds something that lasts. There is one more element of Temujin's early formation that deserves attention before we move toward the great unifications that lie ahead, and it is perhaps the most human element of all: his relationship with Genghis, that childhood friend who had helped rescue Berthe, who had once been his closest ally. His Anda, his sworn brother, deteriorated over the course of several years into open rivalry, and eventually into the most consequential personal enmity of Temujin's early career. The two men were, in many ways, mirror images of each other. Both were brilliant. Both were ambitious. Both understood the steppe deeply and commanded genuine loyalty from their followers. But they differed in one essential way. Genghis was, at heart, a traditionalist. His vision of the Mongolian world was the world as it had always been. A hierarchy of birth, a landscape of competing clans, a balance of power that no single man should ever fully tip. Temujin's vision was something that had never existed before. He imagined a unified people, a single nation beneath a single banner, operating not by the old fracture lines of tribe and blood, but by a new code, merit, law, and loyalty to the whole. These two visions could not coexist. And so, over years of maneuvering and minor conflicts that escalated into major ones, the steppe that had once held them as brothers sorted them, inevitably, into enemies. That contest, and its resolution, would determine the fate of the entire known world. For now, let the steppe settle around you. Let the wind move through the long grass. Somewhere out there on that vast, cold, beautiful plain, a young man without a clan and without a country is looking at the broken world he was handed and refusing, quietly, methodically, stubbornly, to accept that it must remain broken. History, when it remembers this moment, tends to skip ahead to the victories, to the campaigns, the conquests, the maps with their spreading shadows of dominion. But the real story begins here, in the cold, in the hunger, in the long, unglamorous years of a man learning one painful lesson at a time, exactly what the world is made of, and exactly how to remake it. Part 3. One Sky, One People. The Birth of an Empire. Before we can understand the man, we must understand the land. There is a Mongolian phrase that Temujin would later adopt as a kind of founding principle for everything he built. Mean Tengri, eternal heaven. The Mongolians of the 12th century believed that the great blue sky above the steppe was not merely weather, not merely atmosphere. It was a living presence, a sovereign force that ordered the world from above and chose, with deliberate intention, the men who would carry its mandate below. To be favored by eternal heaven was not simply good fortune. It was authorization. It was, in the language of that world, the closest thing to a divine right of rule that a steppe culture had ever articulated. Temujin believed this about himself, not with the brittle arrogance of a man who needs to be told he is great, but with the settled, operational certainty of someone who has examined the evidence of his own survival and drawn the only logical conclusion available. He had been left for dead, figuratively and nearly literally, more times than most men attested in a lifetime. He was still here. Something, he concluded, intended him to be. Whether heaven truly had opinions on the matter is a question we will leave to the philosophers. What is certain is that the belief itself, that deep, unshakable conviction that he was operating in alignment with a larger purpose, gave Temujin a quality that his rivals consistently underestimated and never quite found an answer for. He was unfrightened by the scale of what he imagined. Most men, when they dream large, carry the dream carefully, anxiously, as though it might shatter if handled too boldly. Temujin carried his dream the way he carried a sword, naturally, as an extension of himself. By the time the last decade of the 12th century arrived, the Mongolian steppe had sorted itself into two gravitational centers. On one side, Temujin, now a seasoned leader in his 30s, commanding a growing confederation of warriors drawn from multiple tribes, bound together not by blood, but by sworn loyalty, and the increasingly hard-to-argue with evidence of his military success. On the other side, Jamuka, his former sworn brother, who had built his own coalition from the tribes that remained committed to the old order. Chieftains who understood instinctively that a unified Mongolia under Temujin's particular vision of merit-based hierarchy would mean the permanent diminishment of their own inherited authority. They were not wrong. That is precisely what it would mean. And so they gathered around Jamuka, not purely out of loyalty to him, but out of a shared investment in the world as it had always been. The collision between these two forces was not a single battle. It was a long, grinding, years-long contest of raids and counter-raids, alliances made and dissolved, tribes switching allegiances after a particularly persuasive victory or a particularly damaging defeat. The steppe had been running this kind of calculation for centuries. What made this iteration different was the stakes. For the first time, the outcome would not merely reshuffle which clan sat at the top of the old hierarchy. It would determine whether the old hierarchy survived at all. Temujin lost battles in these years. This is worth saying clearly, because histories of great conquerors have a tendency to edit out the defeats, to present the arc of genius as smooth and uninterrupted. It was not. There were campaigns that went badly. There were moments when his coalition frayed, when tribal leaders who had sworn loyalty quietly began recalculating. The most significant of these setbacks came at the Battle of Kalakaljied Sands, where a combined force of Jamuka's allies inflicted a genuine defeat on Temujin's forces, scattered his camp, and briefly threatened to undo years of careful coalition building. He regrouped. He always regrouped, not with the theatrical resilience of a man performing toughness for an audience, but with the quiet, methodical efficiency of someone who treats disaster as simply another category of information to be processed and responded to. This too was something his enemies could not quite understand about him. They expected defeat to diminish him. It never did. If anything, it refined him, stripped away whatever wasn't essential, sharpened whatever remained. The final, decisive phase of the Mongolian unification unfolded between roughly 1003 and 1206, and it had the quality, as so many of history's hinge moments do, of multiple forces arriving at their conclusions simultaneously. The Tatars, the tribe responsible for his father's poisoning all those decades ago, were defeated and largely absorbed. The Merkits, old enemies, the clan that had once taken Burtay, were broken. His former patron, Togrul, the Genghis Khan, had by this point shifted from ally to rival, and after a complex series of betrayals and counter-moves that reads like a masterclass in political chess, Togrul's power was dismantled and his tribe incorporated into the growing whole. And then there was Jamuka. The end of their long rivalry came not with a dramatic final battle, but with something quieter and, in its way, more revealing. Jamuka's coalition collapsed around him as tribe after tribe came to the pragmatic conclusion that the future had already chosen its direction. He was eventually captured, not by Temujin's forces directly, but by his own followers, who brought him in chains to the man they had once fought against, hoping presumably to curry favor. What happened next tells you something essential about Temujin. He executed the men who had betrayed Jamuka, not his old rival's captors, because a man who would betray his own leader, Temujin reasoned, was a man with no loyalty in him at all, and a man with no loyalty was worth nothing to anyone, regardless of what side he was currently standing on. Loyalty was not a sentiment to Temujin, it was a structural principle. The entire edifice he was building rested on it, and he would not reward its violation even when that violation delivered him an enemy. Jamuka, for his part, is said to have asked for a noble death, no blood spilled, in the Mongolian tradition, reserved for those of high standing. Temujin granted it. There is a version of this moment in which the two former brothers exchange words of genuine sorrow, acknowledging that they had been better together than apart, and that the world had not been quite large enough to hold both of their visions at once. Whether those words were truly spoken, or whether they belonged to the poetic license of later chroniclers, we cannot say with certainty. But the emotional truth of the scene feels right. These were two men who had once shared a fire and called each other brother, and the thing that divided them was not hatred. It was, in the end, an honest disagreement about what the world should be. Temujin's vision won, and in winning, it changed everything. In the spring of 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, the same river near which Temujin had been born, the same waters that had witnessed the beginning of his improbable story, a great assembly was convened. The Mongolians called it a Kurultai, and in form it resembled the tribal gatherings that the steppe had always held, to settle matters of collective importance. But in scale and in implication, it was like nothing that had come before. Every leader of every tribe that had been brought under Temujin's authority gathered in that place. The accounts speak of a great white tent, of a nine-tailed white banner, the tug, planted in the earth as a symbol of sovereignty, of thousands of warriors assembled in a silence that felt, by all accounts, less like the silence before a speech and more like the silence before something permanent. And there, before all of them, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The precise etymology of the title remains a subject of scholarly discussion, but the weight of current understanding translates it as something in the order of universal ruler or ruler of the ocean. The ocean here being the great boundless sea of the steppe itself, which the Mongolians understood as a kind of inland ocean, vast and navigable only by those who knew its currents. To be the ruler of the ocean was to rule without limit, to rule without horizon. For a man who had been abandoned on that same steppe as a hungry 9-year-old boy, the moment must have contained multitudes. But what was actually born on the banks of the Onon River was not merely a title, and it is here that history most often undersells what Temujin, what Genghis Khan, had actually accomplished. He had not simply won a series of battles and declared himself the winner. He had built a state, and the state he built was, by any honest architectural assessment, extraordinary. Begin with the law. The Mongols, before unification, had operated on a patchwork of tribal customs, rules that varied from clan to clan, that could be overridden by the strong, that offered no consistency across the distances of the steppe. Genghis Khan replaced this with the yasa, a formal legal code, comprehensive enough to govern everything from military conduct to trade disputes to the treatment of religious figures. It was not written down initially, as the Mongolian language had no writing system at the moment of his rise to power. He commissioned one. A captured Uyghur scholar named Tatatonga was instructed to adapt the Uyghur script to the Mongolian language, and within a relatively short span of time, the empire had both a written language and a written law. This is the kind of detail that tends to get lost in the thundering narrative of conquest, but it matters enormously. Empires held together only by the force of a single personality dissolve when that personality disappears. Empires held together by law and administrative structure can outlast their founders. Genghis Khan understood this. He was building for a future he would not personally inhabit, and he wanted the architecture to be sound. Then there was the military structure. The Mongolian army was reorganized on a decimal system of almost elegant simplicity. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with its own commander, each slotting into the larger whole with the interlocking precision of a mechanism designed by someone who had thought very carefully about how many things could go wrong in the chaos of battle, and how to reduce that number as far as possible. Promotion within this system was based on demonstrated capability. A man who led his unit of 10 with distinction could rise to command 100. A man who commanded 100 with brilliance might one day command 10,000. It was, in the context of the medieval world, a genuinely revolutionary idea. There is one further dimension of the new Mongolian state that deserves its own moment of consideration, because it surprises people who approach this history carrying the assumption, understandable given the scale of destruction that Mongol conquest would eventually produce, that Genghis Khan's worldview was fundamentally one of domination and erasure. It was not. From the very beginning of his consolidation of power, Genghis Khan displayed a consistency on the question of religion that was, by the standards of any civilization in the 12th century, remarkably tolerant. He himself practiced a form of Mongolian shamanism, a reverence for the natural world, for sky and earth, and the spiritual forces he believed animated both. But he extended to every other faith within his domain the right to practice without interference. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and adherents of dozens of smaller traditions all lived and worshipped within the Mongolian Empire's borders. Religious leaders of all faiths were, in fact, specifically exempted from taxation. An extraordinary policy for an empire of this scale, in an era when religious conformity was the overwhelmingly dominant assumption of every major power on earth. His reasoning, as best we can reconstruct it, was pragmatic as much as it was principled. He was governing an enormous diversity of peoples. Religious persecution would create resistance. Religious tolerance created, if not loyalty, then at least a workable peace. He was a man who consistently preferred a willing subject to a rebellious one, and he understood that nothing produces rebellion more reliably than telling people they may not pray in the way they have always prayed. This is the Genghis Khan that the conventional image tends to obscure, not a destroyer for destruction's sake, but a builder who happened to use conquest as his primary tool of acquisition, and who understood that what you do after the conquest determines whether you have built something or merely burned something down. By 1206, the equation of the Mongolian steppe had been solved. The tribes were one people. The people had one law. The army had one structure, one chain of command, one set of shared expectations about how war was to be conducted. And the man at the center of it all, the man who had once survived on roots and frozen fish, who had been enslaved, who had lost his wife and recovered her, who had watched his closest friend become his greatest rival and had grieved the necessity of that, looked out from the banks of the Onon River at what he had assembled, and then looked beyond it. There were kingdoms to the south, cities of unimaginable wealth, trade routes that connected the known world in long, fragile threads of silk and spice and ambition. There was China, with its ancient dynasties and its seemingly impenetrable wall. There was Central Asia, with its sophisticated Islamic cities and its centuries of accumulated culture. There was Persia, and beyond Persia, the edges of a world that Genghis Khan had never seen but had certainly heard described. He was, in 1206, in his mid-40s. By the life expectancy of the era, he was already an old man. The world that lay beyond the steppe was enormous and defended and complex. He did not appear to find any of this discouraging. The great campaigns, the ones that would stamp his name into the consciousness of every civilization on Earth, were still ahead, and he would approach them the way he had approached everything else in his extraordinary life, with patience, with intelligence, with an absolute absence of the self-doubt that limits most human beings before they begin. Eternal heaven, he believed, had chosen him. The rest of the world was about to find out what that meant. Part 4. The Art of the Impossible. The Military Genius of Genghis Khan. There is a question that serious military historians have been asking for 8 centuries, and it has never quite received a satisfying answer. How did he do it? Not in the broad, romantic sense, not the sweeping narrative of a great man with a great destiny, but in the precise, technical, almost engineering sense of the question. How did an army of nomadic horsemen from the grasslands of northeastern Mongolia, a people without siege equipment, without a tradition of attacking fortified cities, without a navy, without the kind of institutional military knowledge that civilization spent centuries accumulating, dismantle one after another some of the most heavily defended, most administratively sophisticated, most militarily capable empires the medieval world had ever produced? How did they beat everyone? The answer, when you examine it closely enough, turns out to be several answers stacked on top of each other, and each layer, as it comes into focus, reveals something a little more surprising than the one before it. Begin with the horse. It is tempting, because it is so fundamental, to take it for granted. But the relationship between the Mongolian warrior and his horse was not merely a matter of transportation. It was a complete military system in itself, and it operated on principles that the settled civilizations of the medieval world were structurally incapable of replicating. A Mongolian warrior rode from childhood, not rode occasionally, rode constantly, in all weather, across all terrain, for distances that would have seemed implausible to a European knight or a Chinese infantryman. By the time a Mongolian man reached fighting age, his horse was not a vehicle he controlled so much as an extension of his own body that happened to have 4 legs. The physical connection between rider and mount was so intimate, so habitual, that the warrior could effectively fight with both hands while his horse managed its own direction and pace. Each warrior maintained not one horse but a string of them, typically between 3 and 5 animals rotating in use, so that no single horse ever became exhausted. This meant that a Mongolian army on the march covered distances that seemed, to the people watching it approach, almost supernatural. Contemporary accounts from civilizations that faced Mongol invasions return again and again to the same note of bewilderment. They arrived so much faster than anyone had calculated. The intelligence said the army was still weeks away, and then, somehow, it was here. Speed in warfare is not merely a tactical advantage, it is a psychological weapon of the first order. An enemy who has time to prepare can steady his nerves, reinforce his positions, and remind himself and his soldiers of all the reasons they should hold firm. An enemy who has no time to prepare is already partially defeated before the first arrow is loosed. Genghis Khan understood this, and he structured his campaigns around it with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that the mind of his opponent was as important a battlefield as any physical terrain. But speed alone does not bring down fortified cities, and the world that Genghis Khan intended to conquer was full of them. This is the place where the conventional image of the Mongols as pure cavalry raiders breaks down most completely, because the historical reality is almost the opposite of the assumption. Genghis Khan built, over the course of his campaigns, one of the most capable siege warfare establishments in the medieval world. He did it not by independently developing the technology from scratch, why reinvent what someone else has already perfected, but by the characteristically pragmatic method of acquiring the best engineers available and putting them to work. From his earliest campaigns against the kingdoms along China's northern frontier, he began incorporating captured siege specialists into his forces. Chinese engineers who understood the construction and deployment of catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams were absorbed into the Mongolian army as a standing technical corps. Persian and Central Asian engineers, acquired in later campaigns, brought their own traditions of fortification and counter-fortification. The result was an army that could, within a remarkably short time of arriving outside an enemy city, begin constructing and deploying sophisticated siege equipment that the city's defenders had, in many cases, never encountered before. This adaptability, this absolute refusal to treat any domain of knowledge as foreign or inapplicable, was one of Genghis Khan's most consistent and most consequential qualities. He was not, in the conventional sense, a learned man. He appears to have been illiterate for much of his life, or at minimum not a reader in any formal sense, but he possessed what we might call a ferocious intellectual humility, the understanding that he did not need to know everything himself, only to surround himself with people who did, and to create the conditions in which their knowledge could be applied. Many leaders throughout history have understood the importance of delegation in the abstract. Genghis Khan practiced it with an almost radical thoroughness. His generals were not decorative appointments. They were genuine strategists, given genuine authority, trusted to make independent decisions in the field, in ways that would have been simply inconceivable in the command structures of most of the civilizations they were fighting. Let us talk about those generals, because they deserve their own moment in this account. Subutai, Jebe, Mukhali, Jelme. These are names that military historians speak with a reverence that popular history has largely failed to transmit to the wider world, and this is an injustice worth briefly correcting. Subutai, in particular, stands in the estimation of many serious scholars as one of the greatest military commanders in all of recorded history. Not merely the greatest Mongolian general, but genuinely among the most tactically brilliant minds that the profession of arms has ever produced. Born of humble origins, the son of a blacksmith, he rose through Genghis Khan's merit-based system to command armies that ranged across thousands of miles of unfamiliar terrain, consistently defeating enemies who outnumbered them, who knew the ground, and who had every institutional advantage that a settled civilization can bring to bear. What Subutai and his peers shared, and what Genghis Khan both cultivated and demanded, was a quality of thinking that operated simultaneously at multiple scales. They planned individual battles with meticulous attention to terrain and timing. They planned campaigns with an awareness of supply lines, seasonal weather, and the political dynamics of the enemies they had not yet faced, but would. And they planned at the grand strategic level, the question of which kingdoms to approach, in which order, how to use diplomacy and intelligence before the army even moved, how to shape the information environment so that the enemy was already reacting to a reality that had, in some cases, been deliberately constructed to mislead him. The intelligence apparatus of the Mongol army was, by medieval standards, astonishing. Before a major campaign, Genghis Khan typically dispatched networks of spies. Merchants were the favored cover, since a traveling merchant attracted considerably less suspicion than an obvious scout. To gather detailed information about the target civilization's military capabilities, political divisions, economic conditions, and the personalities of its key leaders. By the time the Mongolian army moved, Genghis Khan often knew more about the internal state of his enemy than the enemy's own provincial governors did. This intelligence informed a second weapon that Genghis Khan deployed with devastating consistency: the deliberate exploitation of his enemy's internal fractures. No civilization is monolithic. Every kingdom, every empire, every dynasty contains within itself competing interests, aggrieved minorities, ambitious subordinates who feel inadequately recognized, border populations that feel more loyalty to whoever feeds them than to whichever distant monarch claims their allegiance. Genghis Khan found these fractures and pressed on them before the first soldier moved. Promises were made of autonomy, of protection, of favorable trade terms, of the lives and property of populations that submitted without resistance, and remarkably, given everything else we know about the consequences of Mongolian conquest for those who resisted, these promises were largely kept. A city that opened its gates found itself treated with a restraint that its neighbors, watching from behind their own walls, found deeply confusing. That confusion was itself a weapon. The formal campaigns began with the Tangut kingdom of Xisha along China's northwestern frontier in 1209. This was Genghis Khan's first major engagement with a settled, fortified civilization, and it served as something between a proving ground and a graduate course. The Mongols demonstrated that they could adapt to conditions entirely unlike the open steppe. Attacking fortified positions, managing supply lines over difficult terrain, conducting the kind of sustained multi-season campaign the pure cavalry raiders had never historically been capable of sustaining. Xisha submitted. Genghis Khan's terms were, by the standards of what would follow for those who resisted, moderate. The Tangut paid tribute, provided military support for future campaigns, and continued to exist as a functioning political entity under Mongolian suzerainty. Then came the Jin dynasty. The Jin controlled northern China, one of the wealthiest, most heavily populated, most militarily sophisticated regions on Earth. Their armies were enormous. Their cities were fortified to a degree that reflected centuries of accumulated defensive architecture. They had access to technologies, gunpowder weapons, crossbows, sophisticated artillery that the steppe had never encountered, and they had, for generations, managed the nomadic peoples to their north through a combination of military force and political manipulation, playing tribe against tribe, ensuring that the grasslands remained too fragmented to pose a serious unified threat. That strategy, as of 1206, had a significant problem. The grasslands were no longer fragmented. The Jin War began in 1211 and would continue in one form or another for decades, outlasting Genghis Khan himself. But the early campaigns were revelatory in what they demonstrated about the Mongolian way of war at full deployment. The initial Jin strategy was conventional and, on paper, reasonable, used their superior numbers and fortifications to absorb Mongolian pressure, avoid pitched battle in open terrain where cavalry had the advantage, and wait for the invaders to exhaust themselves against walls they could not breach. The plan collapsed for reasons that the Jin commanders had not adequately modeled. First, the Mongolian army did not exhaust itself. It operated on supply principles entirely different from those of a conventional medieval army. living substantially off the land and off captured jinn provisions, maintaining its mobility even during siege operations by rotating units in and out of forward positions. Second, and more critically, the Mongols did not engage the jinn fortifications directly in the way that the jinn defensive doctrine anticipated. Instead, they bypassed them. While some forces contained major fortresses, the main Mongolian army moved around them, deep into jinn territory, destroying crops, disrupting supply lines, burning granaries, systematically unraveling the economic fabric that the great fortified cities depended on to feed their populations. A fortress that cannot be stormed can still be starved. And a city that is starving is a city whose defenders' morale is doing something that no wall can prevent. By 1215, the Jin capital at Zhongdu, modern Beijing, had fallen. The Jin court retreated south, the war ground on, but its fundamental verdict was already written. There is a dimension of Mongolian warfare that no honest account can omit, and it must be addressed here with the same care and calm that we have brought to everything else. Genghis Khan used terror, deliberately, systematically, and on a scale that the medieval world found almost impossible to process. Cities that resisted and were eventually taken by force faced consequences of a severity that was designed not merely to punish the specific city, but to send a message to every other city that was watching. The destruction of certain cities, and the massacres that accompanied that destruction, was not the uncontrolled violence of an army that had slipped its leash. It was policy. It was calculated. The message was precise. Resistance ends here. Submission costs nothing. Resistance costs everything. The moral weight of this must be acknowledged and not minimized. Hundreds of thousands of people, and across the full span of the Mongolian conquests, very possibly millions, died in these campaigns. The destruction of certain Central Asian cities, which we will examine shortly, represented cultural and demographic losses so severe that some regions did not recover their pre-conquest populations for centuries. This is not a footnote. It is a central fact of Genghis Khan's legacy, and it sits alongside everything else we have said about his genius and his administrative brilliance without cancelling any of it. History does not have a mechanism for trading the achievements of a great figure against the suffering he caused, arriving at a clean net sum. It presents both, and asks us to hold them simultaneously. Genghis Khan was, in the same breath, one of the most organizationally creative human beings who ever lived, and responsible for a scale of human suffering that is genuinely difficult to contemplate. Both of these things are true, and a documentary that presents only one of them is not telling you about Genghis Khan. It is telling you about a person it has invented to be more comfortable. Return then to the question with which we began. How did he do it? The answer, assembled from everything we have examined, turns out to be something like this. Genghis Khan won because he refused to fight the war his enemies were prepared for. Every civilization that faced him had built its defenses against the kind of enemy it had historically faced. Cavalry raiders who struck and retreated, who could not sustain a siege, who fell apart when the grass ran out, who could be managed with the right combination of walls and diplomacy and strategic bribery. He was none of those things. He was a cavalry force that could conduct siege warfare. He was a nomadic army with a sophisticated intelligence service. He was a conqueror who offered genuine alternatives to destruction and genuinely honored those alternatives. He was a military commander who adapted, constantly, fluidly, without ego, to whatever the current problem required. And he was, perhaps most fundamentally, a man whose imagination of what was possible was simply larger than that of every opponent he faced. His enemies were planning for the war that made sense given their understanding of the world. He was fighting the war that was actually available to him, which was a substantially different and considerably more expansive thing. There is a military aphorism, one that postdates Genghis Khan by many centuries. but that fits him almost perfectly, to the effect that amateurs study tactics while professionals study logistics. Genghis Khan studied everything: tactics, logistics, psychology, intelligence, diplomacy, administration, and the particular human geography of fear and loyalty that determines in the end whether an army fights or runs. He was, in the domain of war, the most complete practitioner of his age. Part 5. The Silk Road Burns. The Khwarezmian Campaign and the Paradox of Destruction. There are moments in history that arrive quietly before they arrive catastrophically. The first contact between Genghis Khan and the Khwarezmian Empire was not an army. It was a trade caravan. 500 merchants, Muslims mostly, carrying goods of considerable value, traveled east from the Khwarezmian city of Otrar in 1218, bearing a message implicit in the very act of their journey that commerce between these two enormous powers was not only possible but mutually desirable. Genghis Khan had, by this point, established the broad outlines of a Mongolian empire that stretched across Central Asia's northeastern frontier. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, controlled a domain that encompassed modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. A civilization of ancient cities and flourishing trade, watered by great rivers, wealthy beyond easy description, and militarily substantial enough that its Shah had recently styled himself the Second Alexander. Genghis Khan sent the caravan back with an offer: trade, peace, mutual recognition between two great powers. The message, by all accounts, was framed with genuine diplomatic courtesy. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, had the caravan's merchants arrested and executed. He accused them of being spies, which some of them may well have been, since Mongolian trade caravans frequently served intelligence functions. He sent word to Shah Muhammad, who faced a choice that would determine the fate of his civilization. Muhammad II did not punish his governor. He ratified the decision, and when Genghis Khan sent a second delegation, 3 ambassadors, this time formally diplomatic rather than commercial, Muhammad executed one and sent the other 2 back with their beards shaved, an insult so deliberate and so public that it could only have been intended to communicate one thing: the Shah of the Second Alexander was not afraid. He should have been afraid. What followed was perhaps the most consequential military campaign of the 13th century, and it unfolded with a speed and totality that stunned not only the Khwarezmian Empire, but the entire Islamic world watching from its periphery. Before examining the destruction, however, it is worth pausing to understand what exactly was about to be destroyed. Because the cities of Central Asia in 1219 were not merely military targets, they were among the great jewels of human civilization. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Urgent. These were not provincial outposts. They were thriving metropolitan centers whose libraries held accumulated knowledge from the Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab intellectual traditions. Their bazaars connected the trade of China in the east with the Mediterranean in the west. Their scholars produced advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that would, through translation and transmission, eventually contribute to the European Renaissance. Bukhara alone had been, for centuries, one of the most important centers of Islamic learning in existence. When medieval scholars spoke of the great cities of the known world, these names appeared on the list without qualification. Genghis Khan knew all of this. His intelligence network had been operating in the region for years. He came anyway. The campaign opened in the winter of 1219, and its structure demonstrated, one final time, the full range of Mongolian strategic sophistication. Rather than advancing on a single front, which would have allowed the Khwarezmian forces to concentrate their considerable numbers against a predictable line of attack, Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple columns, operating simultaneously across an enormous breadth of territory. Shah Muhammad, whose military doctrine depended on the ability to read an enemy's axis of advance and position his forces accordingly, found himself confronted with an enemy advancing from several directions at once, none of which appeared to be the main effort, all of which were destroying everything in their path. This was deliberate. Muhammad's strategic response, dispersing his forces across as many cities rather than concentrating them for a decisive engagement, was, given the situation he faced, arguably rational. His empire was too large to abandon any portion of it without political consequence, and he lacked the intelligence to determine where the Mongolian main blow would fall. So he distributed. He defended everywhere, which meant, in the brutal arithmetic of warfare, that he concentrated nowhere. Genghis Khan concentrated everywhere because he had enough army to do it. Otrar fell first, after a siege of several months, in Al-Chuk. The governor, whose decision to massacre the trade caravan had set all of this in motion, was captured and executed in a manner that the sources describe with the grim specificity of a lesson being delivered. Molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. It was a punishment calibrated to the offense. He had destroyed commerce. Commerce was returned to him in the most direct way available. Then came Bukhara. The city's garrison attempted resistance and failed. The population, faced with the alternative, opened the gates. What happened next is recorded in an account that has survived 8 centuries because a scholar named Ibn al-Athir, writing a generation later, understood that he was recording something that needed to be preserved precisely because it was so terrible. Genghis Khan rode into the great mosque of Bukhara, the center of the city's religious and intellectual life, and addressed the assembled population from its courtyard. The speech, as reconstructed from sources, was brief and, in its way, honest. He told them that he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment as great as him. Whether he believed this, or whether it was a piece of theater calculated to paralyze resistance by wrapping conquest in the language of divine judgment, we cannot know with certainty. Both were likely true to some degree. Genghis Khan was a man capable of genuine religious conviction and of manipulating religious sentiment simultaneously, and he would not have experienced any particular contradiction between the two. Bukhara was largely destroyed. Not entirely. Its population was not massacred wholesale, and the city would eventually be rebuilt, but its great structures were burned, its garrison executed, its treasuries emptied. The libraries, those extraordinary repositories of accumulated human knowledge, did not survive. Samarkand fell next, and more swiftly than even the Mongolian commanders had anticipated. Its garrison of perhaps 100,000 soldiers, an enormous force by medieval standards, collapsed in the face of the psychological pressure that preceded the physical assault. Word of what had happened at Bukhara had traveled faster than the Mongolian army, which was itself traveling at a pace that defied contemporary belief. The defenders of Samarkand had heard what awaited resistance. A significant portion of them chose surrender. The Shah, recognizing that the city was lost, fled westward, and would spend the remaining 2 years of his life as a hunted man chased across his own former empire by a Mongolian detachment under Subutai and Jebe that pursued him with the relentless patience of a process rather than a pursuit. Muhammad II died on a small island in the Caspian Sea in 1220, reportedly of pleurisy, stripped of his empire, abandoned by his court, reduced from the self-styled Second Alexander to a fugitive who had run out of land to run to. He never saw a Mongolian face at the end. He was simply consumed by the consequences of a decision he had made 2 years earlier, when a governor's report arrived on his desk and he had chosen the wrong answer. Merv, Nishapur, Herat, Urgench. The names accumulate with a weight that prose struggles to carry. Each city had its own story, Each surrender or resistance produced its own specific outcome along the spectrum between survival and annihilation. Merv, once perhaps the largest city in the world, by some medieval estimates, resisted and was destroyed so completely that its population loss, measured against subsequent census records, represents one of the most devastating demographic events of the medieval period. The numbers proposed by medieval sources are almost certainly exaggerated, as such numbers invariably are. But the adjusted figures that modern historians accept are still, by any honest measure, staggering. It is here that the paradox at the center of Genghis Khan's legacy becomes impossible to look away from. This was the same man who had established religious tolerance as a founding principle of his empire. The same man who promoted based on merit, who commissioned a written language, who built trade infrastructure across the steppe. The same man who, when presented with the scholars and engineers of the civilizations he conquered, consistently chose to incorporate their knowledge rather than discard it. Physicians, astronomers, architects, administrators, all were absorbed into the Mongolian system, valued, protected, put to work. And yet the mechanism by which these people were acquired, the conquest that preceded the incorporation, produced suffering on a scale that is genuinely difficult to weigh against any administrative accomplishment. The honest answer, unsatisfying as it is, may be that these two things did not cancel each other out in Genghis Khan's moral accounting because they were not, in his understanding, intention. The violence was not a contradiction of the project. It was, in his operational logic, a precondition of it. You could not build a unified world without first compelling it to be unified. And the speed with which that compulsion happened, the totality and clarity of the consequences for resistance, actually minimized, in his calculation, the total suffering involved. A world that submitted quickly was a world that stopped fighting sooner. The mathematics were brutal, but they were mathematics. We do not have to accept this reasoning to understand it, and understanding it is important, because dismissing Genghis Khan as simply a destroyer is as historically inaccurate as celebrating him as simply a builder. He was a man in whom these capacities existed simultaneously, fed from the same source, the same absolute clarity of purpose, the same refusal to allow sentiment to override strategy, the same vast and unsentimental view of what the world was and what he intended to make of it. By 1222, the Khwarezmian Empire had ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Its cities were in varying states of ruin and recovery. Its Shah was dead. Its successor state was a Mongolian administrative territory. And Genghis Khan, now in his 60s, turned his horse toward home. He had been in the field almost continuously for the better part of 5 decades. He had ridden across a distance of territory that, measured in its entirety, is almost too large to hold in the mind at once. He had fought campaigns in the cold of Manchuria and the heat of the Central Asian summer. He had lost soldiers, won kingdoms, buried allies, and outlasted enemies. He was old. He was, by any biological reckoning, running out of time. But there was one more campaign still ahead of him, one more chapter of a story that had never, from its very first page, shown any inclination toward a gentle ending. Part 6, The White of the Sky, Final Years, Death, and the long echo of a life. There is a particular quality to the final chapters of extraordinary lives, not tragedy exactly, though tragedy is often present, not triumph either, though that too may linger at the edges. It is something quieter than either of those, a kind of settling, the way a great river, having carved its canyon and turned its valleys and moved its mountains of silt across a continent, eventually broadens and slows as it approaches the sea. The force is still there. The power is still entirely real. But something in the motion has changed. Something in it knows, perhaps, that the ocean is not far. Genghis Khan returned from the Khwarezmian campaign to Mongolia in 1225. He was somewhere in his early 60s. The precise year of his birth remains a matter of scholarly debate, with estimates ranging across a span of several years on either side of 1162. By the standards of his era, his age alone was a kind of accomplishment. The steppe did not produce many old men. The steppe produced warriors, and warriors had a mortality rate that life expectancy statistics in more settled civilizations would find alarming. He was visibly aged. Contemporary accounts, filtered, as all such accounts are, through the particular lens of their author's purposes, describe a man whose physical power had not entirely left him, but whose body was beginning to present, at last, the accumulated invoice of 6 decades of campaign life. Decades of riding in all weather. Decades of wounds absorbed and recovered from. Decades of the particular physiological toll that sustained command exerts. The sleeplessness, the weight of decision, the metabolic cost of existing in a permanent state of strategic attention. He had, by any reasonable external measure, done enough. The empire was the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. Its administrative structures were functioning. His sons and generals were capable of managing its vast territories. He could, in theory, have spent his remaining years in the comfort that an empire of that scale could certainly provide. He did not, of course, do this. The final campaign arose from a familiar source, unfinished business, and the particular version of unfinished business that Genghis Khan found most intolerable. A vassal state that had failed its obligations. The Tangut kingdom of Shisha. The same kingdom that had been the first major target of Mongolian expansion back in 1209. The same kingdom that had submitted and sworn fealty and promised military support for future campaigns, had declined to send troops during the Khwarezmian War. The refusal was delivered, by some accounts, with a degree of open contempt that suggested the Tangut leadership had concluded, perhaps reasonably given the Khan's age and the extraordinary distances involved, that the era of Mongolian consequence was drawing to a close. It was not a good conclusion to have reached. In 1226, Genghis Khan mobilized his army for the last time and turned it southwest towards Shisha. The campaign was brutal and thorough and successful in the way that all his campaigns were ultimately successful, which is to say, completely. The Tangut cities fell in sequence. The Tangut king attempted negotiation and found, as others had found before him, that the window for negotiation closes at a specific moment and does not reopen. But something happened during this campaign that no campaign in Genghis Khan's long career had ever produced before. He fell from his horse. The accounts differ in their particulars. Some attribute the fall to a hunting accident in the campaign's early stages. Others describe it as a consequence of illness that had been quietly advancing for some time before it made itself visible. What is consistent across the sources is that the fall, and whatever physical event preceded or caused it, marked the beginning of a decline from which he did not recover. He continued the campaign regardless. This too is consistent across the sources, and it is one of those details that illuminates something essential about the man, that even in his final year, even with his body failing in ways that he was certainly intelligent enough to understand, the campaign mattered more than the comfort of stopping. He had come to finish something. He would finish it. Genghis Khan died in August of 1227 in the field, as the Shisha campaign reached its conclusion. The cause of his death is one of history's most genuinely unresolved questions, and it has attracted, over the centuries, a remarkable variety of proposed answers. The secret history of the Mongols, the earliest and most important primary source for his life, compiled within decades of his death, is frustratingly imprecise on the specific circumstances, which has left an opening that historians and theorists have been walking through ever since. The competing explanations include complications from the hunting fall, which may have caused internal injuries that worsened progressively throughout the campaign, typhoid fever, or a similar disease contracted in the field, and, in an account that has gained some scholarly traction in recent decades, a wound sustained in a Tangut ambush or raid. There is even a persistent legend, difficult to verify and probably apocryphal, involving a captured Tangut queen whose revenge against her captor took a form that history has not chosen to record with clinical specificity. What we know with confidence is this: he died in the summer of 1227, with the Xixia campaign still in its final stages somewhere in the field. He was, depending on which birth year estimate one accepts, between 60 and 65 years old. He had been in almost continuous campaign for over 2 decades. He had outlasted every significant rival he had ever faced. He had built the largest empire the world had ever seen, and he had, in his final instructions to the men around him, one last piece of strategic thinking to deliver. He asked that his death be kept secret until the Xixia campaign was complete. The army should continue as though he were still alive. The Tangut king should be executed when he came to surrender, which he did, and which was done. The campaign's conclusion should be as total and unambiguous as every other campaign's conclusion had been. Even dying, he was managing his legacy. Even in his final hours, the strategic mind was running. The funeral that followed was conducted according to Mongolian tradition, and Genghis Khan had left instructions about that as well. The burial site was to be kept secret. It has stayed secret for 800 years. The location of Genghis Khan's tomb is, genuinely and without dramatic exaggeration, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in all of archaeology. The broad tradition holds that he was buried somewhere in the Kenti-I mountains of northeastern Mongolia, a region of enormous forested ridges and deep valleys not far from the Onon River where he was born, where he was proclaimed Khan, where his story had its beginning and may have its end. The secret history refers to a place called Burkhan Khaldun, Sacred Mountain, as a site of particular significance to him throughout his life. He had sheltered there as a young man in moments of danger. He had prayed there at moments of great decision. It is widely believed that this is where he rests, but the specific location within that vast landscape has never been found. The ancient tradition holds that the funeral party killed anyone they encountered along the route to prevent disclosure, and that afterward the site was deliberately obscured. Some accounts speak of thousands of horses driven back and forth across the burial ground until the earth showed no evidence of disturbance, of trees planted over the site, of an entire river diverted to run across it. Modern archaeological surveys using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have been conducted across the region. They have found promising anomalies, generated considerable academic excitement, and ultimately yielded no definitive answer. The Mongolian government has, at various times, restricted archaeological access to the most sacred regions of the Kenti Mountains out of respect for local spiritual traditions that hold the area inviolable. He came from that land, that vast and open sky, those cold rivers and endless grasslands. He has returned to it without leaving an address. It is, in its way, entirely consistent with everything we know about him. Even in death, he declined to be found by those who did not already know where to look. He left behind 4 sons by his principal wife, Berte, Joki, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tului, and a system of succession that he had thought about with the same careful attention he brought to military campaigns and administrative structure. Ogadai was named as primary successor, and the transition of power, while not without its tensions, did not produce the catastrophic fragmentation that had undone so many empires at the moment of their founder's death. The Mongolian Empire continued to expand after Genghis Khan. It was his son Ogadai who completed the subjugation of the Jin dynasty in China. It was his general Subutai who led the campaigns into Eastern Europe in the 1240s. campaigns that defeated the Polish and Hungarian armies with such casual thoroughness that the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe entered a period of genuine existential panic, convinced that the end of their world was arriving from the east. It did not arrive, for reasons that had less to do with European military capability than with the internal Mongolian politics that followed Urgedai's death in 1241. The Great Western Campaign simply stopped, pulled back by the necessity of the leadership gathering to determine succession. Western Europe, which had done essentially nothing to stop the Mongolian advance militarily, was spared by a meeting it never knew was happening. The empire eventually reached its maximum extent under Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, who completed the conquest of southern China, established the Yuan dynasty, and became the ruler that Marco Polo encountered and described for a European audience that found the account almost impossible to believe. At its peak, the Mongolian Empire encompassed roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and governed a third of the world's population. All of it traced its authority back to a boy on the steppe who had once eaten roots to survive the winter. What then do we make of him? The question has been asked for 8 centuries and will likely be asked for 8 more. And the honest answer is that no single answer will ever be fully adequate. He was too large, too contradictory, too genuinely unprecedented for any single frame to hold him without distortion. He was a unifier who unified through violence, a builder who built on the rubble of what he had destroyed, a man who practiced religious tolerance on a scale that would not be matched for centuries, and who produced destruction on a scale that also would not be matched for centuries. A leader of almost miraculous personal loyalty who demanded absolute submission from everyone else. A man who rose from nothing, from genuine, life-threatening childhood nothing, to govern the largest empire the world had ever seen, through the force of his intelligence, his will, and his extraordinary capacity to understand and inspire and organize human beings. The modern world, in ways both visible and invisible, carries his mark. The Pax Mongolica, the peace that settled over the trade routes of Asia and the Middle East during the height of Mongolian power, allowed an era of cultural and commercial exchange that transmitted ideas across the known world at unprecedented speed. The Black Death traveled those same routes westward to Europe. So did Chinese gunpowder technology, Central Asian mathematical advances, and the medical knowledge of Persian scholars. The Mongolian Empire was, among other things, an engine of globalization, brutal, involuntary, and nevertheless consequential in ways that bent the arc of human history in directions that would not have been available otherwise. Roughly 1 in every 200 people alive on Earth today carries genetic markers that trace directly to Genghis Khan and his immediate male descendants. The number is so large as to be almost meaningless, and yet it is, as a biological fact, undeniable. He is present, in a literal physical sense, in the DNA of approximately 16 million living human beings. No other individual in recorded history approaches this figure. It is the last, quietest, most intimate dimension of an influence that has never entirely stopped spreading. And so we return, at the end, to where we began, to the steppe, to the wind in the long grass, to the cold, enormous sky that the Mongolians called Mern Tengri, eternal heaven, and believed was watching everything below it with purpose and intention. A boy was born there, in a felt tent, in a year that history has not fully agreed upon, to a minor chieftain who would not live to see his son's 9th birthday. The clan left. The winters were brutal. The boy survived by means that no biography can make entirely glamorous, because the reality of eating roots and catching small animals in the snow is not glamorous. It is merely survival. The stubborn, unglamorous, animal insistence on continuing. And from that, from nothing more ornate or destined seeming than that, came the man who swallowed the world. The Onon River still runs through the Kenti mountains of northeastern Mongolia. The grass of the steppe still moves in the wind in the same slow, oceanic way it has always moved. The mountains are still there, keeping their secret with the patient indifference of geography. Somewhere beneath that sky, somewhere in those forested ridges and river valleys that he loved, that he returned to, that he prayed to in moments of genuine crisis and genuine gratitude, the greatest conqueror who ever lived is at rest. The sky above him is very large. It always was. And somewhere in its blue and permanent silence, perhaps, an answer to the question that his life has always posed. He begins. He endures. He refuses, at every available opportunity, to stop. And then, one summer, the sky takes him back.